Joe Rogan thought he could control the narrative, just like he always does on his show. He interrupted Jonathan Roumie 9 times in 3 minutes, cutting him off each time he tried to speak. But what happened on Roumie's 10th attempt to finish a sentence left Rogan stunned and exposed him as the manipulative provocateur he truly is. The studio lights burned hot above them as Rogan leaned forward in his chair, his trademark confidence bordering on arrogance. He had invited Roumie on the Joe Rogan Experience, expecting an easy exchange, another guest he could talk over, corner with questions, or steer into contradiction. After all, Roumie was just an actor, right? A man known for playing Jesus, not someone trained in political debate. What could go wrong? But Roumie sat across from him with a calm, composed presence. He wore a simple dark shirt, nothing flashy, his hands gently folded, and his expression still. His eyes, however, told another story, full of quiet fire, discernment, and unshakable resolve. He had come prepared. He knew who Joe Rogan was, and more importantly, he knew what Rogan would try to do. Before we dive into this astonishing encounter, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Because what's about to unfold isn't just a debate, it's a moment people will be talking about for years. The tension in the studio was already palpable when Roumie began his first sentence. He had only spoken 3 words before Rogan cut in, voice booming, body leaning in with authority. "But Jonathan," Rogan interrupted mid-thought, dismissing him with a wave of the hand. It was classic Rogan: derail, redirect, dominate. The same tactic he had used for years to unbalance doctors, scientists, politicians, and thinkers. But this time he had picked the wrong guest. To understand why this moment exploded online and beyond, you have to know who these 2 men are, and why their clash meant more than just ratings or entertainment. At 56, Joe Rogan had built his entire media empire on disruption. From his roots as a stand-up comedian and MMA commentator to the most streamed podcast host in the world, Rogan had become a master of using skepticism, sarcasm, and constant interruption to stay in control. He prided himself on being the alpha voice in every conversation, especially when he didn't like what his guest was saying. He would research opposing viewpoints not to understand them, but to weaponize their weaknesses. His team would prepare challenge points, terms and phrases designed to trigger derailments and redirect the narrative. And he was relentless with guests who didn't fit his worldview. Roumie, however, was not a typical guest. At 49, Jonathan Roumie had become a household name not through politics or media controversy, but through portraying one of the most revered figures in history, Jesus of Nazareth, in the hit series The Chosen. Off-screen, he was known for his humility, spiritual clarity, and gentle strength. But beneath that peace was a man who had spent years navigating Hollywood's spiritual cynicism, cultural pushback, and personal trials. He had faced ridicule, pressure, and rejection, and yet had emerged not just unbroken, but sharpened. Rogan wasn't just debating an actor. He was confronting someone forged in fire, someone who had learned to endure interruption not with retaliation, but with deeper truth. Rogan leaned in again, voice dripping with skepticism. "So Jonathan, you've been using your platform to push this whole idea of spiritual awakening and faith over logic. I mean, why do you want people to stop thinking critically and just believe fairy tales?" It was a loaded question, designed to trigger, to provoke, to dominate. The word fairy tales was no accident. It was a calculated insult wrapped in faux curiosity. Classic Rogan. Frame the question so that any response sounds foolish or defensive. But Roumie had seen this coming. He inhaled deeply, his gaze steady. "Joe, I think there's a misunderstanding about what faith truly is. But Jonathan, you can't really say belief in miracles and ancient texts is the same as critical thought." Rogan interrupted again, cutting him off before he could finish. Roumie's jaw tensed slightly, but he didn't flinch. Behind the glass, Rogan's producer gave a thumbs up. The interruption had landed at the perfect moment, right before Roumie could reframe the debate. This was the Rogan method, working like clockwork. "If you'll let me finish," Roumie said softly. "I was about to explain that faith isn't the rejection of reason. It's the harmony between mystery and meaning." "How is that harmony? That just sounds like avoiding hard truths. Sounds like mental gymnastics to me," Rogan scoffed. The pattern was already clear. Rogan wasn't interested in dialogue. He was interested in disruption. His strategy was control, not curiosity. He had marked spiritual concepts like faith, transcendence, and divine purpose as targets to interrupt. But Roumie knew the playbook, and he was just getting started. Jonathan tried a different approach. He adjusted his tone, speaking slightly faster now, not to rush, but to deliver truth before Joe could cut him off again. His experience in faith-based outreach had taught him something the courtroom had taught others. When facing someone aggressive, speak with clarity first and let the silence do the rest. He said gently, "What we're speaking about is not dogma, Joe. It's about something deeper, a shared moral compass, a spiritual standard that invites every soul, regardless of background, to reconnect with purpose." Joe pounced. "So now you want some kind of federal morality police? Let Washington decide what truth is?" He leaned in again, eyebrows raised, voice booming with faux astonishment. It was a signature Rogan tactic, feigned outrage that played well with his audience. The phrase federal morality police had that perfect bite, designed to incite, to distract. Jonathan's eyes flickered for a brief moment, but his voice remained composed. "Joe, if you keep interrupting me, your audience won't hear what I'm actually saying, and they deserve to." That was it, his first direct challenge, and it landed like a whispered thunderclap. Rogan hesitated ever so briefly. Most guests either backed down or exploded when confronted. But not Roumie. He was calm, still, almost unnervingly grounded. Joe reclined slightly, the corners of his mouth curling into a smirk. "Hey man, I'm just asking the hard questions that mainstream media won't." A line rehearsed, deflective, meant to paint himself as a truth seeker, and Roumie as someone who couldn't handle tough talk. It usually worked. Not this time. Jonathan replied, voice firm now. "Then let me answer them." His tone was no longer passive. It had weight, measured authority. "I'm talking about spiritual freedom, the kind that transcends institutions, systems, even suffering. But it begins by allowing people to speak, to breathe." Joe cut in again, louder. "Spiritual freedom? Please, most people just want to live their lives without being told what to believe. This sounds like you're trying to impose something." The pace of interruptions quickened. Joe was energized. He could feel the rising tension, the spikes in viewer engagement. Behind the scenes, producers were probably thrilled, but they didn't notice what was changing in Jonathan. The patient man of peace was still there, but something else had surfaced. Resolve. For years, Jonathan had watched people dismiss the sacred, twist the spiritual, and weaponize platforms for noise instead of wisdom. He had seen cynicism pose as critical thought, and mockery replace curiosity. And now, with the ninth interruption, he understood. Joe wasn't just challenging him, he was performing dominance. Jonathan leaned back just slightly. A small smile formed, not arrogant, but certain, and that's when everything shifted. He turned to face the camera, softly but clearly, and said, "Joe, I want to thank you." Rogan blinked, startled. This wasn't in the script. Guests weren't supposed to thank him. "Thank me?" he asked, confused. Jonathan nodded, and his voice carried a new energy, one of deep spiritual presence. "Yes, you've just given the world a perfect illustration of what suppression actually looks like." Rogan opened his mouth, instinctively trying to cut in. But Jonathan raised his hand. The studio froze. The hand wasn't aggressive. It was commanding in silence, a gesture of peace with authority. And stunningly, Joe stopped speaking. For the first time in the entire interview, Jonathan's tone lowered but sharpened. "In the past 3 minutes, you've interrupted me 9 times. You've prevented me from finishing a single thought. You've used your platform, your voice, your volume, your framing, not to hear me, but to control me. And then you question why people feel unheard in today's world." You could hear a pin drop in the studio. Even the camera crew was unsure what to do. Whether to zoom in on Rogan's blank expression or hold steady on Jonathan, whose posture now radiated the stillness of someone who had just taken the entire room captive, without raising his voice once. Rogan looked stunned. The smirk had vanished. Jonathan continued, "This isn't just about me. This happens to millions of people. In families, churches, workplaces, and yes, in interviews. They speak from their soul and are silenced before they can finish. You, Joe, have given us all a masterclass on how suppression doesn't always wear a uniform or carry a law. Sometimes it just interrupts." Silence. Then Jonathan looked back to the camera, to the viewer. If you've ever been talked over, dismissed, or mocked for what you believe, know this: your voice still matters. Truth doesn't shout. It waits to be heard. And when it speaks, it doesn't need to win the argument. It changes the atmosphere. Rogan's face had gone blank. He looked like a man who realized too late that he'd set a trap and stepped in it himself. But Jonathan wasn't finished. This moment, this pressure, this confrontation wasn't foreign to him. He had spent years preparing for moments like these, though not in studios or Senate halls, but in the quiet crucibles of faith, rejection, and silence. Every harsh interview, every mocking headline, every time someone tried to belittle belief in the divine had prepared him for this. He leaned forward, eyes calm but unwavering. "You see, Joe," he said, voice measured like a closing argument soaked in grace. "What you've just done to me, cutting me off, reframing my words, mocking their foundation, is a mirror of something far deeper happening in our culture. It's not just about faith. It's about who gets to speak and who gets silenced." His words struck like scripture, not shout, but undeniable. People of faith, people with conviction, people whose values don't align with the dominant noise, they're being talked over before they can even begin. You've just made that visible in real time. The camera had already zoomed in, as if it knew this wasn't just a rebuttal, but a revelation. His expression remained gentle, but his presence expanded. Rogan was no longer the center of the show. Roumie had quietly taken command. Jonathan continued, his voice rising slightly, not with anger, but with holy purpose. "You interrupted me when I spoke about divine purpose. You dismissed me when I tried to explain spiritual clarity. You silenced me when I mentioned how media mockery contributes to a generation's spiritual disconnection." He paused, let the air tighten. "And here's the irony, Joe. You've become the very metaphor for the crisis you claim doesn't exist." Joe shifted, visibly uncomfortable now. He opened his mouth, trying to interject, but Roumie calmly lifted a hand again, the same quiet authority. And again, Joe stopped. "9 times, Jonathan said softly. "You've interrupted me 9 times in a matter of minutes. That's not curiosity, that's control." The audience watching from home, Christian, atheist, spiritual but not religious, could feel the shift. The performer had become the witness. The show had become a sermon. Joe finally found his voice, but it sounded thinner now, almost defensive. "Wait a second, Jonathan. I think you're being a bit dramatic." Jonathan leaned in, voice steady as ever. "Dramatic?" His brow lifted, gently. "I'm a man who spends his life trying to help others reconnect with their creator, often in a world that mocks the very idea of meaning. You're a podcaster who makes millions interrupting people. So tell me, Joe, which of us is really being dramatic here?" It was over. Joe knew it, his producers knew it, and the millions watching knew it. Jonathan had not raised his voice, had not insulted anyone, had not strayed into ideology. But in the span of 5 minutes, he had turned Joe's own tactics against him, dismantled his platform strategy, and reclaimed the ground with nothing more than conviction, clarity, and compassion. What followed online was instant and overwhelming. Clips of the interview spread like wildfire across social media. Instagram Reels, TikTok breakdowns, YouTube Shorts with the caption, "This is what suppression looks like." People weren't just quoting Roumie, they were dissecting his tone, his posture, his grace under fire. The phrase "Jonathan Roumie shuts down Rogan" began trending alongside hashtag "Let Him Speak" and #silence no more. Even former Rogan fans were rattled. One viral post read, "I've never seen Joe look that small. Roumie didn't destroy him with facts. He exposed him with stillness." Behind the scenes, Rogan's team was scrambling. Advertisers reached out privately, concerned about the optics of silencing a faith-based guest, especially one so widely respected. One network insider leaked an internal message. "We've built this brand on pushing back, but Roumie didn't push," he revealed. "And now we're exposed." Most telling of all, Joe's own social media. Usually after a controversial guest appearance, he'd post victory clips, smug recaps, quotes out of context. But this time, his feed went dark. No post, no summary, no reaction. He had been silenced, not by force, but by being shown what true strength sounds like when it refuses to shout. Joe Rogan's Twitter account went silent for more than 12 hours. No recap video, no clipped mic drop moment, no victory lap soundbite. The man who usually posted within minutes of every interview, framing narratives before anyone else could, had nothing to say. And in that silence, the internet spoke for him. When he finally broke it with a half-hearted tweet, "Great interview with Jonathan Roumie tonight. Always good to have tough conversations about big ideas." He was met with a flood of biting responses. Even many of his own fans questioned what had happened. Why did you let him talk down to you? You looked shook. He didn't yell. He didn't argue, but somehow, you lost. It was undeniable. Roumie had not just spoken, he had reset the temperature of the entire platform. And then came the ripple. Faith leaders, interfaith coalitions, and even secular humanists began posting in support of Roumie. Not because he argued well, but because he represented something nearly extinct in public discourse: humility with spine. A tweet from Cardinal Timothy Dolan went viral. What Jonathan Roumie did tonight wasn't just eloquence, it was grace under fire, a masterclass in dignified truth. Even atheist thinkers admitted admiration. One notable author wrote, "I don't share his beliefs, but if more people spoke like him, the world would listen more and shout less." Political voices also chimed in across the spectrum. One conservative congressman anonymously told a reporter, "Look, I don't buy the spiritual stuff, but Roumie made Joe look like a fool without ever raising his voice. That's power." In the weeks that followed, universities took note. At Georgetown University, the School of Public Policy added the interview to its curriculum on media power and rhetorical restraint. Professor Sarah Chen explained, "This teaches more about narrative control and psychological framing than a whole semester of textbooks." At Harvard's Kennedy School, a new seminar launched called The Roumie Method, Reclaiming Conversations Through Calm Authority. The course filled instantly. Waitlists grew into the hundreds. Students analyzed Roumie's pacing, his use of silence, his ability to reverse power dynamics without aggression. Law schools integrated the moment into trial advocacy programs, showing how courtroom precision, when married with moral clarity, could deflate even the loudest opponent. Meanwhile, the media couldn't stay away. On CNN, Anderson Cooper opened with, "If you interrupt someone 9 times, don't be shocked when the 10th time ends your credibility." Rachel Maddow on MSNBC dedicated an entire segment to the interview. She pointed out, Roumie turned a hostile interview into a theological parable about suppression. It wasn't just media strategy, it was spiritual aikido. Even traditionally conservative voices struggled to defend Rogan. Radio host Hugh Hewitt said, "Joe made us all look bad. You can't claim to support dialogue and spend the whole show silencing it." Behind the scenes, Rogan's brand faced rare internal tension. Producers admitted struggling to book guests in the aftermath. Potential interviewees now cited Roumie's appearance as proof that Joe's show wasn't a place for honest conversation, but for ambush. Internal platform data revealed a stunning drop. Nearly 200,000 fewer listeners in the coveted 5 to 54 demographic within a month. The illusion of Rogan's invincibility had cracked. Meanwhile, for Jonathan Roumie, the appearance became a defining public moment. Speaking invitations flooded in, from universities, faith organizations, media outlets, and even schools. Clips of the interview were played at corporate leadership trainings, ministry retreats, and media literacy seminars. The phrase "the Roumie method" trended for weeks, defined as the practice of transforming an attack into a mirror by remaining grounded, graceful, and immovable. It didn't stop there. Therapists and relationship coaches began referencing the interview in sessions and webinars about interpersonal respect and conflict navigation. Women's advocacy groups celebrated Roumie not just for what he said, but how he said it. One viral post read, "Imam, he didn't interrupt, he didn't dominate, he let truth speak, and it spoke louder than any shout ever could." Educators began teaching the interview as an example of media manipulation, loaded questioning, conversational suppression. But perhaps most impactfully, activists in the free speech and voting rights communities adopted Roumie's performance as a metaphor. A clip of him raising his hand, gently silencing Rogan became symbolic. This one activist said, "is how suppression often works: quiet, subtle, dismissive. And this," they pointed to Roumie, "is how you answer it. Not with louder words, but with deeper ones." In the end, Jonathan Roumie didn't win by overpowering Joe Rogan. He won by refusing to play the game. He rewrote the script. And in doing so, he didn't just silence a bully, he amplified a generation yearning for calm in the chaos. Community organizers began incorporating clips of the Roumie-Rogan interview into their outreach, not because it was political, but because it revealed something deeper: how easily the world silences wisdom wrapped in calm. Faith groups, media watchdogs, and education nonprofits alike saw the moment for what it was: a parable in real time, not about theology or ideology, but about how truth sounds when it refuses to shout. Even secular organizations embrace the metaphor. A viral tweet from a respected communications scholar read, "Jonathan Roumie just gave us all a new visual language for how conversational suppression mirrors systemic silencing. This is no longer a theory, it's a teaching tool." At voter registration drives, organizers began showing the clip, not because it mentioned voting, but because it showed people what suppression feels like in everyday life. Being interrupted, dismissed, spoken over, pushed to the edge, then punished for holding your ground. In Washington, D.C., media training programs rewrote parts of their curriculum around what became known as the Roumie defense, teaching leaders how to remain composed, redirect narrative traps, and use grace as a counterweight to aggression. Universities followed suit. Political communication departments at Georgetown, Columbia, and NYU began analyzing the exchange frame by frame, showing students how Roumie's timing, pauses, and rhetorical control turned a trap into a teaching moment broadcast to millions. The shift was so noticeable that even large networks began rethinking their own formats. Producers realized that guests, especially those with spiritual or moral depth, were now arriving prepared to call out bad faith tactics in real time. The old method, steamroll, smear, spin, was beginning to crumble because Roumie hadn't just survived a hostile interview, he transformed it. In an age where outrage goes viral and humility is mistaken for weakness, Jonathan Roumie proved something unforgettable. You don't need to shout, you don't need to insult, you don't even need to win in the traditional sense. You just need to stay grounded, stay prepared, and be patient enough to let arrogance reveal itself. What Joe Rogan intended as a performance to dismiss Roumie became a global masterclass in truth-bearing without force. Rogan had cast him as a deluded actor clinging to faith, but by the end of the interview, he looked less like a skeptic and more like a man caught preaching his own irrelevance. Jonathan Roumie didn't just win a debate, he gave us a new standard for spiritual resistance in the public square. He reminded the world that silence can be strength, poise can be protest, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not play the bully's game at all. So if this moment stirred something in you, if you believe that stillness can be louder than spectacle, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're just getting started. Leave a comment and tell us, what was your favorite moment from Jonathan Roumie's interview? And who else do you want to see us break down when truth meets ego? Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to remember what real strength sounds like. Because when we support voices like Roumie's, we're not just supporting faith, we're restoring dignity to public discourse.